Hola a todos. I'm joined today by Microsoft's Chief Diversity Officer, Lindsay-Rae McIntyre. She leads the team accountable for Microsoft's global initiatives focused on increasing diversity and strengthening a culture of inclusion. We're starting with a quick conversation with Lindsay-Rae, and then we will be joined shortly by Professor Kenji Yoshino from New York University School of Law. Welcome, Lindsay-Rae. How are you?
Hola, Mariana. How are you?
Hola. I've been following you for a while now, and you have done so much to promote true belonging. Why talk about diversity and inclusion at a technology event? Why here and why now?
You know, the technology industry these days is innovating and creating at paces and with demands that, you know, are record highs for so many in the industry, whether you're responding to customer demands or creating tech or apps that are going to drive innovation and solutions. We need to drive the best innovation that we've ever done. And we can only do that in two ways: diversity and inclusion. Diversity, because we know diverse teams outperform their homogenous peers, and the science is so clear it's not even news anymore. And then inclusion, because in order to innovate, we must be able to be our authentic selves and to have the opportunity to engage with everything that we can. And the neuroscience of inclusion helps us understand just how difficult it is, impossible it is, to innovate and be our authentic selves when exclusion is present. And so for productivity, for innovation, we have to tackle diversity and inclusion in the workplace and for the developer community specifically.
I sense the urgency in your voice. What leads you to believe this issue is now more important than ever?
With COVID and the pandemic over the last 15 months, and even the surges that are happening internationally as we speak, combined with the acts of hate and violence against the Black and African American community, the Asian community, the LGBTQI plus community, and more in the United States and around the world, it's no longer possible for employees to check their identities at the door. All of that has always come into the workplace, but it is even more pronounced now when we know more than we ever have, when our work and our life are completely linked. And for many of us, we are bringing people into our lives and our homes in ways that we actually didn't intend to or volunteer for before COVID.
Absolutely. And when you talk about leaving certain parts of yourself at the door, that is covering, which is part of the conversation that we're going to have with Kenji. But first, we're going to watch a video. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, covering is a concept that I was introduced to many, many years ago and worked with Kenji and have for some time. It's a global concept. It's ubiquitous, and it actually opens the aperture for understanding the ways in which diversity and inclusion can invite even more people into the conversation, that it isn't about some of us, it's actually about all of us. And so covering has been a really important concept for us at Microsoft to have shared language and shared understanding globally. Once we have the foundations and the science and the language, we need the humanity to understand what it actually means to solve for true, authentic, and psychological safety in the workplace. And so we have the gift of Microsoft employees who've been willing to share with us a little bit about their stories. And we'd love to share those with you now.
Let me tell you what it feels like when I feel like I need to cover. I feel like my shoulders are slouching or I'm curving in as opposed to standing straight backed and confident. I feel like the energy that I have is diluted as opposed to this pure energy that I can put out and share with others and bring to others, right? In my authentic self. There's the circumstance where I've kind of covered and at work in prior companies where I'm with a customer. And it's very easy to speak neutral language about a spouse. And then because I have two kids, I always reference the kids, but it is safe because it's almost assumes heterosexism, meaning the assumption is that I'm married to a man.
My parents are first generation. They always had very thick accents. And that was, for me, something that a lot of people always called out, or were just sort of like those microaggressions would be directed towards enunciation, language, speech. And I internalized that as a kid very early on, and I made it a point to sort of overly index in like enunciating correctly, or just trying to be as well-read as possible to sort of not come across as deficient in that perspective, right? So I just felt people saw my race immediately. You sort of have to shapeshift when you leave your house to something that is like a muted version of yourself. I would always cover my language. If I needed to take a call with my parents or, conduct business in Spanish, I'd always do it in a different room.
We want those who are not of our community, who are not queer, who are not of our ethnicity, who are not of our skin color, to understand what it's like when we have to code switch and cover. It's not a great feeling. We're having to potentially sort of make a false sense of who we are, and just to feel like we can be part of the conversation. And that is something I'm incredibly passionate about.
I did not used to use a cane back then because I actually still had a significant amount of my vision still intact. So I would make a very concerted effort to avoid dark rooms and dark environments because I see a lot less in dark rooms and dark environments. I just didn't want people to notice my eye condition too much, because I thought if they do, then either sympathy would flow or they would think that I'm not, how am I going to be as effective as someone who did not have this eye condition?
I never felt I had to cover anything. But then some experiences later on, one of them starting here in Microsoft, made me think again. The moderator now says, well, I would like to hear how you all felt about yourselves. And that chief of staff says, I feel threatened by Bambo. I looked at him like, well, why would he say something like that? And so he says, well, he's always leaning forward, and he talks with his hands, and his voice is very deep, and he looks serious. Every last person around that table said, why would you feel that? Why would you? I didn't feel this way. I didn't feel. And they all backed me up. That little scar is there, and that was years ago. So the fact that it still is in my mind as a pivotal moment says a lot. Do I always feel like I can bring my authentic self in there? Most of the time, yes, I do. Some of the time, I pause, understand the room, and then deliver.
Wow, that video, it helped me understand what covering is, how intersectionality plays a role, and again, that I cover too, that we all cover at some point in our lives. So for a deeper dive, we have the expert who coined this term. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Kenji Yoshino. Kenji is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School of Law and Director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. He also wrote Covering the Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. Bienvenido, Kenji, mi amigo.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's so great to be with you.
Likewise. And while we got a sense of it in the video, let's start with a definition. How do you define covering?
Absolutely. So covering is a strategy that individuals engage in to downplay a known stigmatized identity to blend into the mainstream.
How is it different from something like passing, for example?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because I think passing is by far the better known term. So when you're passing, people literally don't know that you belong to a particular group. When you're covering, people know that you belong to the group, either because you're unable or unwilling to hide your membership in the group. But they nonetheless put a lot of pressure on you to mute or edit or downplay that identity so that dominant groups can be more comfortable around them.
And now you've defined 4 unique types of covering to better help people understand it and how it manifests in the workplace. Can you walk us through that and share some real-life examples?
Absolutely. So the 4 axes of covering are appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. So they all start with A. You see my weakness for alliteration there, Mariana. But I hope it as a useful sort of mnemonic device. Appearance-based covering has to do with how we change our grooming, attire, or mannerisms, generally our self-presentation, to blend into the mainstream. So an example of that would be an individual with a motor function disability who uses a cane instead of a wheelchair to lower the visibility of that disability. Affiliation-based covering concerns how we avoid behaviors that are widely associated with our group, often to rebut or preempt unconscious biases or stereotypes that people have about that group. So a woman can't do anything to hide the fact that she's a woman. Again, she can't pass, but nonetheless, she may experience enormous amounts of pressure to downplay her caregiving responsibilities for her children, lest she be seen as a less committed worker. Advocacy-based covering concerns how we experience pressure to avoid sticking up for other group members. So a veteran might hear an anti-military joke in the elevator, but might stand down and not say anything about it or challenge it for fear of seeming overly strident. And finally, association-based covering concerns how we avoid other group members. So a gay person might feel completely comfortable saying, "I'm gay," to their close friends in the work environment, but nonetheless refrain from bringing a same-sex partner to a client dinner.
I absolutely approve of your use of alliteration because it's so easy for us to remember them. And I told you this before, I didn't realize that I was covering on many instances being talent on network news by not pronouncing my name the way it's meant to be pronounced or looking less Latina, whatever that means, because I thought that this is not a way to get on television. So thank you for making those examples real for us. And your research has shown some interesting results in how covering impacts the ability for employees to be effective, right? Which is what concerns all of us. Tell us more about that as we explore what this means for our audience of developers today.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing your story of covering, and thank you to everyone in Stories of Us for sharing as well. I obviously have my own stories, and Mariana, you and I have talked about them in the past. But for these purposes, let me actually go to the research and say that the management consultancy Deloitte and I partnered on a major survey-based study of thinking about how covering might impinge on people's experiences in the workplace. And what we found, just to give you some top-line statistics, was that 61% of respondents reported covering along one of those axes. And of that 61%, 60 to 73% said that this was somewhat to extremely detrimental to their sense of self. So it really hurt them. And then we moved on to ask whether leaders within organizations were asking their employees to cover. And 53% of respondents said, yes, our leaders do expect us to cover in the ways that you've just described in your television career. And of that 53%, 50% said that this covering expectation somewhat to extremely diminished their commitment to the organization. So again, if you're looking for that leak in your pipeline where incredibly talented employees are getting pushed out of the organization, this is a really good place to look, because 53% of 50% is not nothing.
No, those numbers are staggering. And Build has a global audience who span a range of identities and cultures. Have you seen differences in how covering surfaces along different identities, different roles, and regions?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. In the name of authenticity, I should admit to you that I thought this was going to be a real vulnerability of the study, because I often think, as many people do, of authenticity as being a very US value or perhaps a Western value, and thinking that it might not play as well in other jurisdictions around the world where the value of assimilation is much stronger. So I grew up a quarter of my life in Japan, for example, and my instinct was that if we went to Japan, the degree of covering or the kinds of covering would be different. And what we discovered was that this is truly a universal phenomenon. What changes country to country is really the kind of social distinction that people feel like they have to cover. So that, if you go to, say, India, then it's a regional distinction between the North and the South that is being covered, or caste distinctions that are being covered. And many other areas of the world, it is religious identity that is being covered. So if you go to many jurisdictions in the Middle East, that is what you find. If you go to Japan, a country that I have great sort of affection for, what I found a lot of was regional covering with regard to accent. So people often used to ask whether or not somebody spoke Hyojungo, which is, standard Japanese. But also, one thing that was quite surprising was the degree of emphasis on educational attainment, not just what you majored in or how well you did, but what university you went to, whether you had graduate training, and so on and so forth. And what's so fascinating about that, just to put a button on it, is that, yes, there are these distinctions that you see country from country, but not only is covering universal, right, across all of these jurisdictions, it's also that sometimes we think that we found something that's very distinctive to a particular foreign jurisdiction, that when we bring it back to the United States, we see that there's either an existing or a nascent movement around opposing covering along exactly that dimension. So Lindsay-Rae and I were talking earlier about how increasingly in the United States and in the workforces that Microsoft touches, educational attainment is a major axis of covering. You have people who have been autodidacts, who have taught themselves how to code and who are brilliant coders, who nonetheless feel like they have to downplay the fact they didn't go to an Ivy League university or even a university in order to train themselves. Obviously, at the end of the day, what any employer should care about is how good you are at your job, not what kind of letters you have after your name. And so that insight from Japan becomes newly important and topical, even in the United States.
So fascinating. I'm already thinking of what I covered growing up in Latin America versus the United States, and you definitely made it real for our audience of developers on here. And Lindsay-Rae before also mentioned how employees obviously can't leave what happens outside of the workplace at the door when they show up to work. So how does covering show up in the context of employees trying to deal with social or political issues in the outside world?
So we originally thought about this most deeply with regard to work-life issues, with regard to gender. So if you are a parent, I'm a parent myself, I know that I can't leave those issues at home. And if something is happening at home, I'm going to bring that into work with me. Increasingly, though, we've broadened the lens and realized that if there is an issue of police brutality, if there is a shooting in Atlanta, if there are hate crimes against the Asian American community, people are not going to be able to leave that at the doorstep. So oftentimes, one of the things that we have to understand when we're thinking about covering issues is that oftentimes what people are covering are not things that happen to them inside of the workplace, but things that happen to them outside of the workplace, and not just in the home environment, but in the broader national or regional communities that they reside in.
Absolutely. And in the workplace, it feels like there would be sort of an inherent tension between the idea of professionalism and authenticity that happens when people don't cover. So my next question is, where does an organization draw the line? How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I love that question as well, because, I think I often surprise people when I say not all forms of covering are bad. And they say, well, you're the authenticity guy. Don't you think that all forms of covering are terrible and that all forms of authenticity are good? I say, well, wait a minute. What if I came to your workplace tomorrow and engaged in rabidly antisocial behavior? And then, Mariana, when you said, Kenji, you really got to knock it off, I said, well, I'm just an obnoxious person. This is my authentic self. So you have to accept me because you love uncovering so much, right? So clearly, not all forms of covering are good. We want me to cover that, right? So that pushes me to the harder question of what's a touchstone? How do I distinguish between the good and the bad forms of covering, which is really your question. And I think that the two-word answer to that is organizational values, in this study that I mentioned that I did with Deloitte earlier, one of the things that we found is that many people said, oh, I have to cover my political affiliation at work. I have to cover the fact that I'm liberal or that I'm conservative. And we said no harm, no foul, because no organization that we surveyed stated as one of its organizational values that it wanted to include people's capacity to express their political affiliations at work. One could argue that that value should change, but at least there was no hypocrisy involved because the organization was living its values. In stark contrast, every single organization, Mariana, that we surveyed said it believed in the inclusion of women. But every single organization in our survey had women reporting out of those organizations saying we have to cover our childcare responsibilities. So in the second instance, we would say that that is a problem because that's an organization that is out of one side of its mouth expressing an organizational value of including women, but out of the other side of its mouth demanding that women suppress or cover their identities in a way that men would not have to do.
I would love to bring back Lindsay-Rae for this last part of our conversation. And Kenji, I'll start with you. With COVID and the rise in working from home, has any of this changed? Has the tension around being your authentic self shifted?
Yes, I hate to be deflationary here because I know you're an optimist, Mariana, and I know that Lindsay-Rae is a diehard optimist as well, as am I. But I have to say I have a little bit of a deflationary take on the intersection between the pandemic and covering. I think the conventional wisdom that has emerged around the pandemic is that the silver lining to COVID has been that it has created more opportunities to uncover. And I want to sort of fight that Pollyanna-ish narrative by looking at the ways in which people are uncovering when they are in virtual environments. So say you're on a Microsoft Teams meeting and your Great Dane, I have a Great Dane, and your 8-year-old and your 9-year-old are running around in the background. It then becomes impossible for you to cover the fact that you have other responsibilities in your life. But, notice that that's actually not necessarily a good thing because I haven't voluntarily uncovered that. So a really key piece of whether or not we think that authenticity or uncovering is a good thing or a bad thing has to do with my exercise of volition in that project. And if the virtual environment is forcing me to divulge things that I wouldn't otherwise want to divulge, then that has a totally different social significance. Just to add another example that I'm hearing a lot about from colleagues and organizations that we work with here at the center, oftentimes in organizations, very junior people are talking to very senior people, and the very junior people are sort of desperately zooming in from some corner of a tiny apartment that they share with roommates, and the very senior person is going into that same environment on Microsoft Teams from their yacht. Right. And so that is a really uncomfortable exchange on both sides and leads to a lot of covering, particularly with regard to the more junior person.
And now on to my other optimist in the virtual room here, Lindsay-Rae, how can technology help this?
I think there's been some incredible innovation over the course of COVID to give people control, as Kenji talks about. When we think about blurred backgrounds, when we think about on-demand captioning, the opportunity to engage with colleagues in the chat, either one-to-one or one-to-many. These are some of the features and functionality that the tech have enabled to give us back some of that control. And so, the work that we have to do together is to earn the trust and be able to support one another, to create the conditions for somebody to have the choice to uncover should they want to. But the opportunity for the technology to give control back to the individual, really critical.
Another question for the both of you to end. Kenji, I'll start with you. What is the antidote to covering? Because I know many people are wondering, how can workplaces or leaders begin to address it in a meaningful way?
Yes, and it's a critical question for us to address because sort of stop covering is not going to be enough. That's not going to cut it, right? So I want to offer up 3 quick, hits to this. So the first one is to be able to diagnose covering demands and to think them through on your own. So first of all, ask yourself whether you're covering along one of these 4 dimensions of appearance, affiliation, advocacy, or association. Ask yourself whether this hurts or harms you. If it does harm you, ask if your organization has some kind of value, right, that would justify that covering demand. And if the answer to that is no, then think about how you're going to challenge the organization to live up to its own values. The second point is to share your story, right? So one of the things that has been so powerful in doing this work is to listen to junior people say, our leaders have to go first to model authenticity, because if they don't go first, we won't go at all. So one of the things that makes me so excited about Stories of Us is that you have individuals who are willing to color outside of the bounds of a traditional resume to show their humanity to their colleagues. And one of the most effective things that you can do when introducing yourself to either an internal or external audience for the first time is to, again, share a little bit more of yourself than is reflected in a usual professional environment. And then watch what happens, because narratives stimulate counter narratives and a climate of greater authenticity for everyone. And then finally, my center has been really privileged to collaborate on allyship work with Microsoft. Being an active ally is a broad spectrum antibiotic. It solves many, many issues in diversity and inclusion above and beyond covering, but it certainly is a powerful antidote to covering. So rather than looking at someone and psychoanalyzing them and saying, are they covering or are they not covering? Instead, train your sights on the person who's making the covering demand on them, right? And then use your energies as an ally to challenge that covering demand when it's made by the source of non-inclusive behavior. So if an individual says, if you want this promotion, you should downplay your children more, or if you want this promotion, I don't want you to bring your same-sex partner to work functions, then you as an ally can step up and challenge that demand. No psychoanalysis of the affected person is required there.
Great.
So to sum up, diagnose those covering demands, share your story, and then finally be an active ally.
Great action items, Kenji. Lindsay-Rae, I'd love your perspective on this to end.
Yeah, for us at Microsoft, allyship has really been about growth mindset in action. What are those habit formation change actions that we can take at an individual level? And allyship at Microsoft isn't a cape or a title that we give ourselves. It's a verb. It's a practice. It's something that we do meeting to meeting and moment to moment to invest in our own self-awareness and to care about a colleague enough to understand what support looks like from their perspective so that we can really be clear about how we show up for one another and we don't jump in eagerly, but rather care enough about them to engage meaningfully and then keep learning. The growth mindset piece is critical here because we are going to fail at this. Absolutely, we're going to fail at this. And so the opportunity for allyship to be the opportunity for us to try and fail and learn and get better is really important, because without it, we stay in the safe place of cheering others on or being intimidated and nervous to enter the conversation, or maybe not wanting to share that extra piece of ourselves, as Kenji talked about. And so investing in allyship skills, I think, a really critical way for us to collectively unlock the opportunity for authenticity and innovation to surge.
No doubt this conversation has contributed to that growth. Thank you, Kenji. Gracias, Lindsay-Rae, for joining us here today. It was a tremendous honor for me as a Latina and as an immigrant to have moderated this discussion. And you can learn more from Kenji and many other thought leaders on the topic of diversity and inclusion on Microsoft's Inclusion Journey site. It hosts conversations like this one with other experts in the field, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, Chase Strangio, deputy director for trans justice and attorney with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV project, and Dalia Moghahid, director of research, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Go to aka.ms/inclusion journey for insights from those experts and others for employee stories and diversity and inclusion learning content you can use. Gracias a todos.